Right, if you're planning on starting some seeds in February, don't start anything just yet because timing is everything. Every year I see gardeners making the same mistake by starting some things too early, only to end up with leggy, weak plants that struggle to grow all season. But if you get it right and sow the right things, you can be harvesting crops weeks or even months ahead of everyone else. So in this video I'm going to be going over the crops which you should be sowing in February and the crops which you absolutely should not be sowing in February. And I'll also go over a simple mistake that can ruin your plants before the growing season has even started. So let's go. Okay, so first we're going to go over the seeds which you should probably hold off on until around March, April, May time because it's just too early to be sowing them in February because they grow really fast, and if you were to sow them now you're going to end up with massive plants that are ready to be planted in your garden before your last frost date, and they're not frost hardy, so that could be a massive problem further down the line. You'll end up with weak leggy plants that will be pot bound, and I'm talking about things like courgettes. That's the first one which I wouldn't sow until around April time. I actually sow these middle of April and then I plant them out around the middle of May. Yeah, hold off on sowing courgettes in February because it's just too early for them. The second crop which I would hold off on for quite a while is sweet corn because sweet corn grows really fast as well, surprisingly fast actually. You could direct sow sweet corn outside in May after your last frost date and you'll still get a crop before the end of the growing season because they grow super fast. Another one which I've seen some people start quite early in the past only to end up with massive plants before the last frost date is beans. Whether it be dwarf beans, climbing beans, French or runner beans. February for most people is far too early to be sowing them because they grow really quick. You can end up with a bean plant that's like that in a matter of just a few weeks. So hold off on sowing beans for another couple of months yet. And other members of the cucurbit family like pumpkins and squashes as well, hold off on sowing them until a bit later. So sowing those crops in February versus sowing them in April and May, which is a more ideal time to sow them, could be the difference between having a crop failure and having a successful crop. If you were to sow them in April and May, they'll grow much faster than what they would if you sowed them in February, so it isn't really worth sowing these any earlier than what you need to. Now the crops which you can sow in February, let's get into those. Now if you've got space to keep these where there's plenty of light, maybe a south-facing windowsill that's quite bright, or maybe you have some grow lights, you can sow some tomatoes in February. Now I love growing tomatoes and I actually sowed mine at the end of January simply because I've got grow lights where I can keep them protected, and I've also got a polytunnel that I can keep them protected early on as well. If you're growing them outside, or maybe you only have a small greenhouse and you don't have space at home, sow your tomatoes in March and April. But if you want to try your chances and you've got space to keep them where you've got plenty of light and you can keep them protected from the frost and you can keep them warm, you know, start them in February if you want for an early crop. Now we're going to get into the crops which are much more suitable for sowing in February. It's not very risky sowing these because they're either hardier crops or even cool season crops which grow better at this time of year, or the things which we're definitely going to be starting at home. In fact, it's best that we do start them at home early because they do require a long growing season. The first thing is bell peppers, but also chilies as well. I'm going to attach a picture of the seeds over the screen because you probably can't see these very well, but I'll show you them anyway. Yeah, I've got some bell peppers and chilies here. No matter what type of chili you want to grow or what bell pepper you want to grow, sow them in February. I've got Beauty Bell, Fiesta, and King of the North as well. King of the North are a good one for growing in cool climates, so ideal for growing in the UK. And yeah, I started mine in January. They're starting to poke up now at home under the grow lights. It is crucial that you start these off at home where it's warm. Bright sunny windowsill is absolutely vital. South-facing windowsill. But if you can get hold of some grow lights, do be sure to check the reviews first and make sure that they're a good brand. You don't want anything to cause any problems, any electrical fires or anything like that. Make sure you get something that's safe. Broccoli, cauliflower, this variety is all year round. Even Romanesco cauliflower, which is a very unusual one, very strange pattern, that's an interesting one. Cabbages as well, you can sow some of them in February. Brussels sprouts, sow some of them too. Even kale. All cool season crops, they prefer the cooler weather that you get in the spring, but make sure you give them plenty of light. That is actually one of the most common mistakes that a lot of gardeners make at this time of year. That's the mistake which I spoke about at the beginning of this video. When starting seeds early, it's important that you give them enough light. Bright south-facing windowsill at home should suffice from February onwards for most plants, or for any cool season crops that can tolerate the cold, a greenhouse like this where the plants can get plenty of light, like these brassicas here, which I've got in this module tray. They are able to get enough light so they don't grow very leggy. If you're sowing brassica seeds on a windowsill at home in February, the light levels aren't that great, so you can end up with brassica plants that do get quite leggy. You know, I found that they do require quite a bit of light so they don't grow all leggy and weak. If you do end up with brassica plants that are a bit leggy, you can transplant them later on into something else, but bury part of that stem. That can help things a little bit, and that's the same with most plants, especially tomatoes. If they become too leggy, when you transplant them afterwards, just plant them a little bit deeper so you bury some of that stem. But that is one of the most common problems and one of the most common mistakes I see a lot of gardeners making early on, is not giving them enough light. Light is more important than heat. If I were to give one of them up when starting a lot of crops, it would be heat, because, you know, for a lot of things, room temperature usually will suffice. It just means slower growth. But if you've not got enough light, plants will grow slower, but also they'll grow leggy, weak, and you may end up just losing them altogether. So make sure you do not cut this out when you're starting things early. Make sure you've got enough light. Now, you could also be sowing some onions in February as well. It doesn't matter if you're starting onions from seed or from sets. You can start them from February onwards. If you're doing them from seed, then, you know, get a tray like this, or even a container like this, a 9cm container, or even modules like this. Fill them up with multi-purpose compost, sow a few seeds lightly, and then just cover them with a 1cm layer of compost, which you might want to sieve, or get a seed and cutting compost, which is already fine for sowing small seeds. South-facing windowsill at home with plenty of light. Greenhouse if you want, or even outside, because onions are quite cold hardy. Onions from seed do take a bit longer, and they are a bit more finicky, and they do require a bit of an earlier start, and they do take longer. So onion sets might be a bit more beginner friendly if you're just getting started. Get some onion sets, plant them. You can do them in these actually. These are ideal, these multi-cell things. Just pop your onion sets in the cells like that, with the pointy side facing upwards, and then plant them outside around March, April, May time. You can start them off in these to give them a head start, or you could just directly plant them outside if you want in February. Space them around 4 to 6 inches apart roughly. They can be spaced quite close together, but the further you plant them apart, the bigger the onions will get, so bear that in mind. Now, whilst on the topic of onions, we're also going to go over another vegetable in the onion family, and that is leeks. You can sow some of them in February as well, and you can start leeks off in a very similar way to starting onion seeds. Start them off in trays and then plant them outside around April, May time. Now, with leeks, I've found they can be very sensitive to fluctuations in temperatures, so if you've got a lot of warm days and cold nights in the springtime, it can make them bolt or produce seed. It's when the plant goes into reproductive mode because it's stressed and it tries to produce seed, and cold nights and warm days can initiate that. So do be mindful of that. It probably is best to plant these leeks out in your garden when day and night temperatures are a bit more consistent. I'm saying, temperatures in the mid to high teens during the day, and then no lower than 10 degrees Celsius at night. In the spring, sometimes we can have days where it's 25 degrees Celsius and then it gets down to freezing at night. That is not uncommon in the UK in spring, especially around May time. That happens quite a lot. Yeah, just be mindful of that. They're very sensitive to fluctuations in temperatures. And also spring onions as well. You can get some of them sown in February. Direct sow them outside if you want. They'll take a bit longer to grow, but they'll still grow. But if you want to give them a head start, you can sow 4 or 5 seeds in each cell, and then after a few weeks time you can just transplant the whole thing outside. But honestly, I would just direct sow them outside. They will germinate in time, just a bit slower in February. Now we're going to go over one of my absolute favourite crops to grow, and it's a really good one for starting from February onwards. They're really good for successionally sowing, so you could sow a few in February, and then you could also sow a few in March as well, and even April, May and June, in order to get a steady harvest through the growing season. And I'm talking about beetroot. Now beetroot, there just is nothing like homegrown fresh beetroot. Not the stuff that you get in the supermarkets that's pickled and just tastes of vinegar. Beetroot are a really lovely one to grow yourself, and they're really easy to grow as well, and they're quite cold hardy as well. In fact, they do prefer the cooler temperatures that you get in the spring. Now I've got bolt hardy, and I've got this lovely variety which I tried growing last year, Boldor, a lovely golden beetroot. Absolutely fantastic. I pickled loads of it last year because we just had too much of it. You can sow them direct outside in your garden as well if you want, so long as your ground isn't frozen, and they will germinate gradually, and you should have some nice little seedlings emerging after just a few weeks. But if you want to give them a head start, you can sow them in modules like this. So 2 or 3 per module in a greenhouse or a polytunnel, and then when they've got a couple of true leaves per plant, just transplant the whole thing out. And then when it comes to harvest time, just pick out 1 or 2 of the beetroot from the clump, and then leave the remaining ones to grow a bit bigger. Beetroot does grow quite well in clumps. And the thing with beetroot is I found it doesn't like a soil that's really, really rich in nitrogen, because that can produce lots of leafy growth, but not so much in the way of roots. That's just what I've found over the last few years. Whenever I've incorporated any nitrogen-rich materials to my beds, I've had lots of leafy growth. Whereas last year, the bed that I have has just a lot of topsoil in it, so it's not particularly rich in nutrients, and it gave me some really good beetroot. And it's also worth noting that I grew them in raised beds, so they're very well draining. Beetroot doesn't seem to like a soil that's heavy, that gets too wet. I've found it likes to be loose and well draining, does beetroot. Now we're going to go over something which, to be honest with you, isn't absolutely necessary that you sow in February, but you will probably get an earlier crop if you do decide to sow them in February, and that is carrots. I've got some sweet candle carrots here, and I'm also going to be growing some early Nance carrots this year too. I really do love my carrots, and no matter how cheap they are in the supermarket, I'm still going to grow my own, because there is just nothing like fresh homegrown carrots. The flavour is just something else. So yeah, carrots, loose, well-draining, sandy soil that isn't too rich in nutrients, because if the soil's too heavy, the carrots can't grow to a nice length, and you don't want any big bits of material in there either. You don't want any stones, because that can make the root fork and go off in lots of different directions. And similarly, if you have a soil that's too rich in nutrients, that can also make the carrot go in funny directions and all over the place as well. I grow carrots in the exact same beds every single year. I have done for the past 3 or 4 years, and I don't add any nutrients to it. I don't add any compost, I don't add any fertilisers, I just sow my carrots in there every year, and most of them grow to a really good size now. And They're all pretty uniform actually. You do get the odd one that's a bit funny and goes in a bit of a weird shape. But yeah, that's the key thing with carrots, I think. Space them far enough apart so that they can grow to a decent size, 3 or 4 inches, and make sure the soil is loose, nice and sandy, incorporate plenty of sand in there, make sure there's no large bits, maybe you need to sieve the soil so there's no large stones in there, and don't add too much compost because that can make them grow all funny. So carrots, yeah, sow them direct outside in your beds. You can grow them in the open ground, but bear in mind that they're probably not going to grow as uniform as growing them in raised beds. You can grow them in containers. I've grown them in containers many times in the past. Just make sure that they're deep enough, at least 12 inches deep really, to get some good lengthy carrots. Yeah, I grew some in here last year. You can plant them in containers like this early on, keep them in your greenhouse and get a crop much earlier. But if you want to sow them outside direct in your bed, you can do that in February. Sow a line of them thinly and then thin them out a bit later when they start to germinate. Just be wary of the carrot root fly. Do not do it in the peak of the day. Don't do it in the middle of the day because that's when the carrot root fly is most active. And yeah, they will take a bit longer to germinate outside in February, but they will still germinate just fine. They'll just take an extra week or two as opposed to starting them off under cover. Maybe place a plank of wood over where you've sown the seeds so that when the sun hits the plank of wood, it warms it up, thus warming the soil underneath, meaning quicker germination. Okay, I don't want to ramble on too long. I'm probably going into too much detail with each seed here, but hopefully you can take some information from this. Now, we're going to go over another cool season crop which is good for starting in February because they can germinate in temperatures as low as 1 degree Celsius. So, that's ideal for this time of year. And it's all sorts of different lettuce leaves. These are a really good one for sowing in February. I sowed some in January and they're just starting to germinate now. Just getting into February. 2 or 3 weeks they've started to germinate. You probably can't see that because they're so small, but they are germinating. I've got a mixed packet of lettuce here which will grow every single year. They're really good. I'm also growing some spicy leaves as well. You can direct sow these outside so long as your ground isn't frozen, or you can start them in modules like I have to plant outside later. I found it is beneficial to give them a head start first and then plant them out. I do that with quite a lot of things early on. And there really is nothing like picking your own homegrown lettuce, lovely crisp leaves to have in your salads in the summer. For something that's so easy to grow and so expensive to buy in the supermarkets, it's well worth growing. Now I'm going to go over sweet peas in this video because sweet peas are a good one for starting in February as well. I'm going to sow mine in February. When I get the rest of them, I'm still waiting for a few more packets of them to arrive. But yeah, those are really good for starting in February. Surprisingly cold hardy as well, and they will germinate in quite cool temperatures. You can start them off in a bright sunny windowsill at home, or grow lights if you have them, or you could just start them under cover like this if you want. In 9cm pots, so 3 or 4 per container like that, and then a bit later, around April, May time, plant the whole thing outside. You can start them in root trainers as well. I found that is good for starting off sweet peas because they have quite long roots. Or if you want, you could direct sow them outside so long as your ground isn't frozen, and they probably will germinate slowly and they'll start growing happily through March and April just fine. And at least you won't have to harden them off if you do this. But yeah, sweet peas can tolerate light frosts. They can germinate when temperatures are quite cold. Just be mindful that, if you are direct sowing them outside, be careful with rats and mice and things like that because they might try and have a go at them. And that brings me on to the next one, which is an edible version of the sweet pea. The garden pea, of course. Peas can be sown quite early as well, especially the dwarf varieties like Kelvin and Wonder, those that grow a bit earlier and aren't really your tall main crop varieties. Kelvin and Wonder and other dwarf peas are quicker growing and give a crop earlier on. I mean, peas are a cool season crop anyway. They produce a crop earlier in the season when it's a bit cooler. If you are growing them in the summer, it's best to give them some shade because you know, they don't like the hot temperatures. And you can sow them in lots of different things. I mean, you could probably sow them outside direct if your ground's not frozen, of course, or you can sow them in modules like this. There really is nothing like picking your own fresh homegrown peas, and even snacking on them raw is quite nice. They're quite sweet and quite tasty. They're a nice snack to have when you're out in the garden. Now, the last crop which I'm going to go over in this video is something which you can start preparing for now, because most places are starting to sell them now for planting, and that, of course, it's potatoes, isn't it? One of my favourite things to grow. And what you can do in February is you can buy your seed potatoes and start chitting them. Chitting them is the process of letting them sprout and produce, you know, little shoots like that before you plant them. You can do this around 4 to 6 weeks before you plant them. Now, I'm going to plant my potatoes around mid to late March roughly, so February is the time for me to start chitting them. I'll start doing this around the middle of February, and actually I've already got some here, as you can see, that are started to chit already. These are potatoes which I saved from last year. Now, you'll get your seed potatoes like this, pop them in a tray like this if you want. Just place them in the tray and lay them out nicely, or use egg cartons. That's another good one for starting to chit your potatoes ready for planting. If you chit your potatoes, you'll get a head start. You know, you'll get a couple of weeks head start as opposed to just planting the potato like that. It really does make a difference, I've found. And you want the chits to be around about 1/2 inch to 1 inch in size, like that roughly. Put them somewhere like a north facing windowsill at home, somewhere that's cool but not too warm, that doesn't get direct sunlight, because you don't want them to be on a south facing windowsill that gets direct sunlight all day, because that will just make the potatoes dry up and shrivel, and it can damage them sprouts that start to grow on it. You just want some nice natural light with temperatures that aren't too warm, because if you put them next to a hot radiator at home, that can also make them shrivel up and lose moisture. So those were some of the things which you can sow in February, but also some of the things which you can't sow in February, which you might want to wait until later on. In fact, I'd say it is best that you wait till later on for some of them. But yeah, there's quite a lot you can sow in February actually. You know, spring is just around the corner now, and we're thinking about getting things sown in preparation for the season ahead. And doing this now will give us a good head start on the growing season. So I hope you found this video useful. If you did, remember to hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already and you want to see more videos like this through this growing season. That's all for now. I will see you in the next one. Happy sowing and happy growing.